Welcome back to another episode of the RICA Test Preparation Guide. If you find this series helpful, please make sure to click the like button below and also make sure to subscribe to keep up to date on new episodes and some of my other hopefully useful teaching resources and materials that I post quite frequently. Today, we're actually going to be looking at Competency 2, which is solely focused on reading assessments. So let's get started. So Competency 2, this episode on reading assessment, is going to be focused on some of the following elements. So we're going to look at the purposes of reading assessments, alternative assessments for students with IEPs or 504 plans, interpreting and using the assessment results, independent, instructional, and frustrational reading levels, communicating those assessment results, validity and reliability in your assessments, percentile scores, and grade equivalent scores. So that's going to be what this episode is going to be focused on. So first, we're going to look at the purposes of reading assessments. So the first kind of assessment we have are entry-level assessments. These assessments are used to determine which students have mastered the prereq skills, or they can also be used to determine which students have already mastered the skill you plan on teaching. So entry-level assessments will help you determine how to scaffold your lesson and which students may need more support. So this is going to be really useful when you're trying to differentiate your instructions, or when you're trying to make those small groups based on maybe if the students have those prereq skills that they need, or which students may need more support or less support. Then there are formative assessments. These assessments are conducted throughout an instructional unit. The data collected from formative assessments should be used to determine which students have grasped the standard and which need more support. You're also going to need to analyze this data at both a student and whole class level. When you analyze data at a whole class level, this can help you determine if a majority of the class did or did not understand the lesson. You should use this data to determine if you should reteach the lesson again in maybe a different instructional style, or whether only a small group of students did not understand the lesson. Formative assessments will also help you understand where a student may be struggling. These kinds of assessments can be formal, such as quizzes and tests, or they can be informal, such as observing student behavior and discussion. Overall, you will want to plan several formative assessments throughout the instructional unit. Then we have summative assessments. Summative assessments are used at the end of an instructional unit or periodically throughout the school year. These assessments will help you determine which students are performing above, below, or at grade level performance. In other words, these assessments are used to determine if a student has mastered a certain standard or a group of standards, in other words. Now, before we go into ways you can alter your assessments for students with IEPs and 504 plans, I just want to quickly review some information related to IEP and 504 plans. So an IEP, also known as an Individualized Educational Program, is actually a plan that describes what accommodations and or modifications a student requires. A 504 plan is a plan that describes what accommodations a student requires. So the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan is that an IEP allows the student to receive accommodations and modifications, while a 504 plan allows for accommodations. So what's the difference between accommodations and modifications? A modification means what the student is expected to learn is altered, while accommodation means how the student is expected to learn is altered. So in other words, a modification means that the student may not be learning what their fellow classmates are learning, while an accommodation means how the student is being taught the material may be different from their fellow classmates. So now let's look at some alternative assessments for students with IEPs or 504 plans. There's a lot of ways you can adjust your assessments to meet the needs of your students with IEPs and 504 plans. One way is by providing more time to complete tasks. For example, you may provide students with 20 minutes to complete an assessment, but you would provide your student with disabilities with 40 minutes to complete the same assessment. so you're extending the amount of time that they have. Another alternative would involve breaking the assessments into smaller segments. So instead of giving an assessment and providing that 40 minutes to complete it, you could break up the assessment into 2 days and provide the students with 2 20-minute segments. Then you have change the style of delivery. So rather than having the student complete a written assessment, you can provide your students with disabilities with an assessment that allows them to demonstrate their understanding in a better way that suits them. For example, you may choose to assess them through a one-on-one oral assessment, or even provide them with a more project-based assessment. Then you could provide practice assessments. So in other words, you could provide extra feedback to your students with disabilities prior to having them take the summative assessment. The practice assessment should not be the same as the summative assessment, so you would use different questions and reading excerpts. Finally, you could provide appropriate assessment materials. In other words, if an assessment does require students to read a passage or excerpt, you're going to want to provide your students with disabilities with reading material that matches their individual reading level. If this is the case, then you would note this modification in the student's portfolio or file. Now let's look at ways of interpreting and using assessment results. So there are 3 main ways that we use assessment results. First, assessments can help us identify which students may need more or less support throughout an instructional unit. Then, they can help us determine whether students are grasping the lessons and whether you should reduce your pace or maybe implement different instructional methods for certain students or even for the whole class. Finally, they can also be used to help us identify overarching patterns in both individual students and the whole class. So, do more students meet performance expectations and understand the standards when you implement a certain instructional method or strategy? Is a student just struggling with 1 or 2 concepts, or is there a continuous struggle that calls for individual intervention? Assessment data should be collected and analyzed to answer these questions and steer your instruction. Now let's take a look at independent instructional and frustrational reading levels and what they actually mean. First, there's independent reading levels. This means that 95% of the words are read correctly and that 90% of the comprehension questions are answered correctly. Then there's instructional, which means 90% of the words are read correctly and 60% of comprehension questions are answered correctly. And finally, frustrational, which means that less than 90% of the words were read correctly and less than 60% of comprehension questions are answered incorrectly. So your independent reading level, it means that it's material that the student can read on their own with no assistance. On the other hand, instructional means that the material is something that the student can read, but they need assistance from a teacher or an adult. Finally, frustrational is reading material that the student cannot read on their own or even with assistance. Now, how do we determine a student's independent, instructional, and frustrational reading levels? Well, we perform an informal reading inventory, also known as an IRI. This form of assessment contains numerous smaller assessments, such as a reading interest survey, graded reading passages, concept of print assessments, phonemic awareness assessments, phonic assessments, word recognition lists, vocabulary assessments, reading fluency assessments, and structural analysis assessments. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on graded reading passages and word recognition lists. We already covered reading interest surveys in episode 1, so make sure to watch episode 1 of this series for more information surrounding the purpose of reading interest surveys. Below in the description, I'm also going to put in a link to an article that will further break down the components, so each of these assessments of an IRI. We're going to also cover the rest of these assessments in later episodes. So now let's take a deeper look at graded reading passages. During a graded reading passage, you will have a student read a passage out loud. While the student is reading, you will perform a running record. Performing running records take practice and it can be difficult at first. Afterwards, you will also ask the student some comprehension questions. So here are the main elements of a running record. And we're going to go over an example in a minute here. So during a running record, you're going to listen out for any substitutions, omissions, insertions, self-corrections, and when you need to perform an intervention, and repetition. So let's take a look at what these words actually mean on a running record. So here is an example of a running record. Now you can see that we have our passage right over here. This is what the student would be reading. They would have a copy for themselves, and you would have a copy too that you're going to mark on. So when a student is reading the passage and they make a substitution, it means that the student has substituted a word with a different word. For example, changing diddle to daddy. If the student read, hey daddy daddy, instead of hey diddle diddle. And how you're going to mark a substitution is by writing the word that the student says over the word they were supposed to say. And this is going to count as an error on a running record. Then we have self-corrections. A self-correction means the student says the word incorrectly, but corrects themselves right after their error. In this situation, you would write the word they said, and then SC stands for self-correction. And this would not count as an error on a running record, but you would still mark it. Then we have insertions. An insertion would mean the student adds in a word while reading the passage. To mark an insertion, you would write the word and then an arrow pointing to the place of the insertion. So this would count as an error on a running record. Then we have omissions. An omission would mean the student did not say a word or phrase while reading the passage. This would be shown as a line over the word. It means they did not say the word. This would count as an error. So, for example, the student would have said, the dog laughed, rather than the little dog laughed. Then we have repetition. A repetition means the student repeats a part of a word, or whole word, or phrase. You would mark this with an R over the word, or the phrase. Then we have an intervention. An intervention means a child has stopped reading and you either told the student to try again or you told a student what the word was in the passage. So you just told them. If you told the student to try again, you would mark that word with the letters TA, like try again. Now, if you gave the word to them, you would only mark it with a T. This would count as an error. And I don't know if I said this, but repetition would not count as an error. So after completing the running record, you would then perform a miscue analysis for any patterns. These reading errors then fall into three groups, which are graphophonemic errors, semantic errors, and syntactic errors. So now let's take a closer look at the three errors that I just said. So the first one would be graphophonemic error. So a grapheme is a single unit to represent a sound in a writing system. On a running record, they might label it as a visual error. So, for example, let's say you provide the student with a sentence that says the small fish swam away from them. And instead, they said smell instead of small. So a child who makes a graphophonemic error is usually either doing it for two main reasons. So either they're reading word for word and depending a little bit too much on phonics to decode the word, or they're reading a passage that's just too difficult. It's too hard for them. So then we have semantic errors. Semantics is the meaning behind words. When you're doing a running record, they might label this as a meaning error. So for example, you provide the student with a sentence that says, they went to the camp in the woods. And instead they said forest instead of wood. So Obviously, the student knows what they're reading. It's just they need to focus more on phonics and reading what the passage actually says. Then we have syntactic errors. Syntax is the order of words and phrases. It would also be marked as a structure error on running records usually. For example, you give the student the sentence, "The kids jumped into their beds," and instead they say jump instead of jumped. Now again, the student knows what they're reading, but they still need to focus on their phonics and identifying that the words do not mean the same. So now let's take a look at what word recognition lists are. Word recognition lists are lists of words for every reading level. As the reading level increases, the list of words increase in difficulty. And word recognition lists have three main purposes. First, they help us determine a student's reading level. Then they assess the student's sight word knowledge. And finally, they assess the student's ability to use phonics to decode words. Now, when using word recognition lists, you would have a chart of the words contained on the word recognition list. And as the student is going through the words, you would mark the words that the student said correctly, read correctly. And then you would also write down what word the student said when they read the word incorrectly. For example, if the word was sat and they said sit, you would write that down. Now let's take a look at ways you can communicate assessment results. So there's numerous ways you can communicate assessment results that I'm sure you can find, but here are some main ones that you can use to communicate with students, parents, and the school and district. So for students, you could provide daily informal feedback. So this could involve walking around the classroom and providing corrective feedback or informing the students on what they're doing well. Then there are student conferences. So similar to parent conferences, this would just be maybe every month you have a sit down with a student for about 10 minutes and let them know what they're doing well in and what you guys are working on together to improve. Then there are student progress reports, and that is a written type of form that lets the student know their strengths and their weaknesses at the current moment. Then when communicating with parents, you can utilize routine progress reports. So every week you could send home, or every other week, just something that lets parents know where their student is at the moment. Then there are parent conferences. As we all know, we've heard of parent conferences. You could have the student there, you could not. And it's just you having one-on-one conversation with the parent about where their student currently is at in terms of reading development. Then there are achievement reports. So that means letting parents know of where their student has grown in their reading and their strengths. Finally, there's the good old email and telephone. So emailing parents to let them know or calling them. Finally, for school and district, there's going to be achievement summaries. So that's where you're going to monitor and write down students' progress, and you're going to put it in their portfolio. And to be honest, this is going to follow them until they reach middle school and high school. And it's just going to let other teachers know and districts or schools a student's current strengths and weaknesses in reading. Then there are reading coach assessments. So if a student requires intervention or extra support, this would be any assessments that you and the reading coach have created and are using to monitor the student's progress. Now let's take a look at validity and reliability. These are two concepts that you need to keep in mind when you are performing reading assessments. So validity is when a test measures what it's supposed to measure. In other words, students may actually struggle with some comprehension questions, not because they didn't understand what they read or that it's a reading level that is frustrational, but rather because they don't have the background knowledge needed to answer the question. If a student does not have the background knowledge related to the passage, then the validity of the comprehension question may be too low, and you might want to throw that out. Or you might want to find a reading passage assessment that contains background knowledge that the student has. For example, one of my former professors told me a good example for this concept. If a young student who has never been to the snow in their life encountered the sentence, "The snow pierced her bare hands," they might struggle to understand some of the key concepts of the book or the passage. The student might not understand the sentence at all because they don't have any background knowledge and experience to make sense of the statement. To them, piercing would be that it's stabbing them, when people who have been to the snow would know that just means that the snow's really cold. Then we have reliability. Reliability means when a test is consistently accurate. In other words, if a student takes a reading test on Monday and gets a score of 90%, then in essence, they should still get a score of around 90% on Tuesday, the next day. The tests should be different questions, different passages, but the scores should be consistently accurate in portraying the student's reading level. Example of an unreliable assessment would be if the student suddenly got 60% on Tuesday. Then we would definitely say that that assessment was not reliable. So now let's take a look at percentile and grade equivalent scores. These are the type of scores you're going to see from standardized testing results, and they're the two main forms of scoring. So let's take a look at them. So for percentile scores, above 50%, let's say a student gets above 50%, that's considered above average. If a student gets exactly 50%, that's going to be considered average. That means that they performed above 50% of a sample size of students who took the same test or assessment. And then lower than 50% is considered below average. Now let's take a look at grade equivalent scores. So a number higher than the student's grade level would mean that the student is performing above grade level expectation. For example, all these examples, we're saying that the student is in 4th grade. So anything above a 4.1 would imply that they are above 4th grade reading standards. Then a number equal to the student's grade level would mean that they're at an average level of reading. Then a number less than the student's grade level, for example, like 3.9, 3.5, anything below a 4.0 for a 4th grader would mean that they are performing at below average. Now here are the main takeaways that you need for the RICA in terms of Competency 2. So just a summary. So I'd make sure that you really study these areas. You need to know that the 3 main purposes of reading assessments are to determine a student's current reading skills or levels, so entry-level assessments, to monitor their progress throughout an instructional unit, also known as formative assessments, and to determine the extent of a student's achievement after the completion of an instructional unit or period of time, so summative assessments. You also need to know that assessments help us determine and monitor whether our students are meeting state standards. This is the main purpose and use of assessment results. We also discussed some other purposes, but you should know this predominantly. You must provide students with IEPs and 504 plans with alternative assessment options. You need to make sure that you know and remember the various ways we discussed that you can alter your assessments to meet the needs of your students with disabilities. Informal reading inventories help us determine our students' independent, instructional, and frustrational reading levels. So take the time and review and practice the process of administrating like graded reading passages and word recognition lists and just the whole entirety of an informal reading inventory. We're going to, again, cover the other assessments contained within the IRI later in the series, but definitely gain some practice right now doing those graded reading passages and word recognition lists so you know them forward and backwards. You should also know the percentages associated with the 3 reading levels, so independent, instructional, and frustrational. You should be able to define the terms validity and reliability in terms of reading assessments. So again, validity means that the test is measuring what it is supposed to measure, and reliability means the test scores are consistent. Finally, understand the difference between percentile scores and grade equivalent scores and how you would interpret them. So percentile scores are percent-based, and a score of 50% is considered average. Grade equivalent scores are based around the student's grade level. For example, if a student is in 3rd grade, then a score of 3.0 would be considered average for a 3rd grader. Overall, you need to fully understand and study these areas of competency too. I hope you all found episode 2 of the RICA test guide helpful. If you have any questions, please make sure to leave a comment below. In the next episode, we're going to be covering Competency 3, so we'll be starting Domain 2. Thank you all so much for watching, and please make sure to click subscribe and the like button if you enjoyed this video, you find it useful. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you all soon during the next episode of Teaching with Miss Robles.